Tao sending an old poem to Yuan. The style and mood of poems, everyone has his own, but the delicacy and subtlety of a scene only I understand. To extol flowers in the moonlight, I show my love of the pale. To write of willows in the rain, I make branches droop. For long I've been told to hide away these pieces of green jasper, but after all I carry them along on red paper that I made. Old age makes it impossible to collect all my verses. I send some to you as if teaching a young boy. Okay, so here we have a poem by Zhen Tao, who lived in the late years of the 8th century, early years of the 9th. And she is probably the most famous and the most distinguished women poet of the Tang Dynasty, perhaps competing in this with Yu Xuanji. Okay, so I think in previous videos when we presented some examples of female poetry, which is generally overlooked in the 300 Tang Poems anthology, we said that Tang female poets can basically be classified into three baskets. So one basket is courtesans, another one is Taoist priestesses, and another is elite women, members of the imperial family or their immediate servants. The Tang Dynasty was not the worst period in Chinese history for women, but under the aegis of a very strong Confucian ideology, which would only crystallize and consolidate in the following centuries, women did not a priori have a public space in China, and they didn't in the Tang Dynasty, although the fact that the Tang Dynasty had been founded by northerners with mixed barbarian blood and more accustomed to the customs of the frontier lands of the north where women had more autonomy. This and a few other accidental events in which strong women managed the court in the early Tang, might give an impression otherwise of a certain degree of female freedom. But this, as I say, this was always constrained by, in Confucian ideology, the woman's space is in the home. And she is the moon to the husband's sun. She must be secluded and she must be devoted to household duties. And poetry composition, as we've seen in the Tang, is a very public type of activity, and especially the most favorite poetry is scholar official poetry composed, if not in a courtly background, at least in a scholar official background. So we said female poetry falls into three baskets. We've already seen, for example, some poems by Shangwan Wan'er, who was a member of an aristocratic family and close to the top echelons of Tang aristocratic society. So this is an example of some of the very few women who, because of their blood or connections, could transcend these typical limitations of women as restricted to the household. Taoist priestesses are similar. There's also a certain degree of ambiguity. I don't know too much about the rules of Taoist nuns, but they were certainly looser than the rules of Western nuns. And sometimes this set overlaps with the set of courtesans, notoriously with Yu Xuanji, who we will encounter further on. And the last basket is entertainers. So these entertainers were a little bit like the Greek hetairae. They were women who came from probably not too wealthy backgrounds, but who received a good education. And the topmost layer of these women entertained scholar officials, and if they were very lucky, they might become the concubines of some rich and powerful scholar official or bureaucrat. So in the capital, you had them very close to the Imperial University and relatively close to the Imperial Palace in a ward that was just south of the Imperial Palace. And the courtesans there were expected to, be really cultured, good entertainers, good at playing games. good at flirting, good at singing, playing musical instruments, and also good at composing poetry. They were supposed to compose poetry generally of a frivolous nature, love poetry, for their scholar official lovers. And as I said, some of these courtesans achieved a certain level of prestige and published some poetry. So Xue Tao falls into this basket. She was from a not too well-off family in Chang'an. Her father was a minor official. When she was relatively young, in her 14, her father died in Chengdu in Sichuan, in the west of the country, and the family got stranded and without any means. So she became an entertainer at the behest of the military commissioner of Sichuan. So she became an official state-paid courtesan for the purpose of entertaining honored guests at public functions, and that's basically where she stayed most of her life. She was very talented, very good at composing poetry, allegedly from an early age. And she served different military commissioners, and in fact it was even suggested that she be presented to the throne to become an editor, which is the reason why one of her nicknames is New Shulang, the female editor. And she managed to establish a network of contacts with some of the big voices in mid-Tang poetry. So she had poetry exchanges with Pei Du, with Ling Huchu, with Liu Dushi, with Bai Juji, and in particular with Yuan Chen. In fact, Yuan Chen went to Sichuan in 809, and there he met face-to-face the renowned poetess, and this was apparently the beginning of a lasting close relationship, which I don't know if it included, but probably did, the personal beyond the literary. The poem we've read is precisely one of a set of poems that she composed and sent to Yuan Chen, and allegedly she wrote them in colorful tablets with fur and flower patterns, which she designed and manufactured herself. So the poem is the typical poem of this sort of writer. Most of the female poets of the courtesans had a very restricted repertoire. Their poetry is almost always thematically a poetry that celebrates brief unions or laments the separation from male patrons, erotic, occasional. Although some critics have emphasized the presence of satire and hidden metaphors and a melancholy sadness in her poems. And well, she lived for quite a long time, I think. Quite a long time, until her 60s. And she always stayed in Chengdu, retiring to the outskirts and continuing to compose poetry and practice calligraphy. About 90 poems out of an alleged collection of 500 of hers have survived. Okay, let's take a look at this poem. As usual, couplet by couplet. This is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay, this looks on the face of it to be a heptasyllabic regulated poem. And the middle couplets seem parallelistic. So this is probably a regulated poem. And the topic, is, we already said, it's a poem sent to this Yuan Weiqi, Yuan Chen. So let's take a look at it. It's very metapoetic because the poem, more than talking about the sadness at separation from the great scholar official, is really talking about Xue Tao's composition of poetry, her aesthetic interests in the composition of poetry, and it can be read as, to a certain degree, pretty proud and pushy on her own literary abilities. So first couplet. The style and mood of poems, everyone has his own, but the delicacy and subtlety of a scene, only I understand. So, the poem starts with the first couplet that's pretty straightforward. It's not saying anything like, oh, beloved Yuan Chen, I miss you, or how sad I am, sighing, pining away in your absence. No. The poem starts speaking about poetry composition, And, it starts saying, every poet has a style or tries to have a style, and the poems of every poet try to express a mood. This is, very general, but I, myself, Xue Tao, am especially good. I am the only one who really understands how to create scenes which have delicacy and subtlety. So she is a background composer of space in her poem, and the words she uses, delicacy, subtlety, they connect with what we would call traditional female tropes. As the women as more delicate, more subtle, more. But still, this is pretty proud boasting. Second couplet. So the second couplet, which is the first parallelistic couplet, gives us an example of these delicate and subtle scenes that only she has the power to master through her wordsmithing. To extol flowers in the moonlight, I show my love of the pale. To write of willows in the rain, I make branches droop. So here we get a taste of, how does she convey this subtlety and delicacy of scenes. So she probably tries not to be too direct. She gives us two images, which are, pretty hackneyed or conventional images of Chinese poetry: flowers in the moonlight and willows in the rain. Traditional metaphors of spring or of longing for the departed one, because you're looking at the flowers awake at night, or the rain is like tears falling from heaven. Willows are associated with parting. When you part from somebody, you give them a sprig of willow. But the important thing is not flowers in the moonlight or willows in the rain, but how does she deal with this subject? And she does in a very subtle way. So how does she talk about willows in the rain? Well, she focuses on branches drooping. Maybe she doesn't explicitly mention that they're willows in the rain, but she evokes willow branches drooping under a weight. What weight? Well, the weight of the rain, presumably. And again, maybe she doesn't speak directly of how beautiful flowers are in the moonlight, but she shows a love, an appreciation of paleness. And flowers under the moonlight would be, the epitome of a faint, pale beauty, a beautiful scene. So she's telling us about her tricks of the trade, her poetic arts. Third couplet, which again is a parallelistic couplet. So she moves from her technique to her texts in general, and she says to her writing practice. For long I've been told to hide away these pieces of green jasper, but after all I carry them along on red paper that I made. We mentioned before that she wrote poems for Yuan and she made the paper and she decorated it. So this red paper includes those pieces of green jasper, which we could interpret as her poems, perhaps. Yeah. Oh, well, there are many references. Remember, Chinese poetry is very ambiguous, so like Angela Jung Palandri and Yen Hauser mention here that this could be a reference to a concubine of the king of Runan, who was known for her unassuming ways. It could be a reference to Xue Tiao's verse that seems to match pretty well, or even to the paper in which the poems were written. But anyway, she's been composing these little jewels, these little gems, and she takes them with her, even though others have told her, put those poems away, don't write poetry or don't show it. But no, she's defiant. Yeah, she's writing these poems for a famous poet and sending them to him. I mean, this very poem, in a very meta-poetical way, is a poem sent to a poet, and a poem about poetry. Okay, finally the last couplet. Old age makes it impossible to collect all my verses. I send some to you, as if teaching a young boy. So again, the poem ends on a note that I could only describe, at least in the translation in my interpretation of it, as pretty defiant. Like, there's this, she wrote a lot of poems, and, that is real, so, but there's a rhetorical gesture in the old age, which she's probably not that old when she composes this poem. She's, I don't know, maybe in her 30s, 40s, well, not so young, maybe for the pre-modern era, but well, she's not an old crone, and but she wrote a lot. Yeah, we said about 500 poems. So she's stating, she's sending the message. I've written a lot of poems. I'm sending you some, and these are decent pieces. I send some to you as if teaching a young boy. So Yuan Chen, a very important politician and courtier, a grand counselor, a very famous poet, one of the most famous poets of the Mid-Tang period, with his friend Bai Zhuji, with Meng Jiao, with Han Yu. But this woman is pulling no punches. She's saying, I'm sending these poems to you as if I was teaching a young boy. So I'm good. I'm teaching you with these poems. So there's probably a little bit of playfulness and coyness and irony in this message, we could say, in the last lines. Yeah, although others have interpreted it differently, some alluding to the possibility of a son that she might have had with Yuan Chen. But anyway, whatever the background, this is quite an interesting piece, unconventional in that, as opposed to the traditional expectations of courtesans' poems, this is not a poem about love, sadness, and separation from the scholar official, or a lively evocation of the time they spent together. This is a poem about literature, about the author's ability at composing poetry, and yeah, it's very interesting.